So let me just say something about this, what I'll be doing in this particular talk. I'm going to first start out with a brief discussion of homuncular explanation and the constraints that are built into that conception. I'll then look at mechanistic explanation as that has been described recently in the philosophy of science, in the literature on explanation. And then I will look at some attempted justifications of the homuncular constraints in the face of the difficulties that there are with the particular constraints that are specific to homuncular functionalism. Okay, so first part is the nature of homuncular explanation. So, part of what might be called the catechism of homuncular explanation is something that we, at least philosophers of mind, grow up as learning as part of how you explain the mind psychologically, right? So this is Bill Lycan, right, one of the more famous people within the homuncular functionalist tradition. He says it was Atneve's insight, Atneve is a psychologist in the 1960s, it was Atneve's insight that homunculi can, after all, be useful posits, so long as their appointed functions do not simply parrot the intelligent capacities being explained. For a subject's intelligent performance can be explained as being the joint product of several constituent performances, individually less demanding, by subagencies of the subject acting in concert, right? We account for the subject's intelligent activity not by idly positing a single homunculus within that subject, whose job it is simply to perform that activity, but by reference to a collaborative team of homunculi whose members are individually more specialized and less talented. The team members' own functions are specified first, and then the explanation details the ways in which the members cooperate in producing the more intelligent corporate explanandum activity. Okay, so there's a very standard view of sometimes called homunculism, homuncular explanation of the mind, where you've got some types of various kinds of subpersonal capacities. You can think of them as being more or less modular, and then these all work together and they give you, at the personal level, right, the intelligent being, right, such as one of yourselves. Okay, and here I just want to emphasize this idea that you're positing subcapacities that don't simply parrot the capacity of the person, right? Otherwise, you would somehow be idly positing something. Okay, and Daniel Dennett similarly has a very similar picture of homuncular explanation as well. If you can get a team or committee of relatively ignorant, narrow-minded, blind homunculi to produce the intelligent behavior of the whole, this is progress. If we then look closer at the individual boxes, we see that the function of each is accompanied by subdividing it via another flow chart into smaller, more stupid homunculi, right? So he's imagining a nested bunch of, so there's the big man, and then nested within that are, the homunculi, the little men, and nested within each of those little men is another little man, and so forth, right? Eventually, this nesting of boxes within boxes lands you with homunculi so stupid, all they have to do is remember to say yes or no when asked, that they can be, as one says, replaced with a machine. Okay, one discharges the fancy homunculi from one's scheme by organizing armies of such idiots to do the work. Okay, and here, he introduces the idea of discharging the homunculi. So eventually, you start with the personal level capacities. You have all these different under capacities that get stupider and stupider and stupider until you end up without any intelligence at all. Okay, and this is also related to Bennett's Personal-Subpersonal, right, distinction, where he's described this in a number of various papers that he's written, but in a discussion that he has with Maxwell Bennett and Peter Hacker and John Searle in 2007. They're having a back and forth on neuroscience and subpersonal capacities. And here he describes the subpersonal level, right, is the level of hemi, semi, demi, proto, quasi, pseudo processes that figure in explanations that posit agent-like systems that have part of the prowess of the person, right, until one gets to simpler, less person-like agents that are so stupid they can be replaced by a machine. Okay, so again, so here we've got a personal-subpersonal distinction, right, in which, first of all, you have a view of capacities that are full-blown, right, that's the personal level, right, and then you've got them in ever-decreasing fraction blown, right, and that's the subpersonal levels, right, and as Lycan also emphasizes, it's not just one. We talk about the subpersonal level, but it's, it can be multiple, and that nothing hangs on that. Second thing, there is a mapping in Dennett's view, and Lycan's as well, and Cummins and so on and so forth. There's a mapping of these capacities to mereological whole-part relationships, right? So you've got the person, they have the full-blown capacities, and you've got the subpersonal levels, right, with all the parts, right, and these are cognitive, modules just for simplicity, we'll think of them that way, and at those subpersonal part level, right, you've got the less than full-blown capacities. Okay, so you've got the two hierarchies of the whole and the part, and the full-blown capacity and the subcapacities that are ever stupider. Okay, so in short, I mean, just to use, to combine all that together, homunculi, if you're talking about homunculi in a homuncular explanation, these are the subpersonal posits in a homuncular explanation of an agent's intelligence, which is essentially a decompositional explanation. Okay, and the motivation for this picture is also, very clear. There seems to be very clear epistemic motivation. As Dennett puts it, again, the account of intelligence required of psychology must not, of course, be question-begging. It must not explain intelligence in terms of intelligence, for instance, by putting clever homunculi at the control panel of the nervous system. A non-question-begging psychology will be a psychology that makes no ultimate appeals to unexplained intelligence, and that condition can be reformulated as the condition that whatever functional parts a psychology breaks its subjects into, the smallest or most fundamental or least sophisticated parts must not be supposed to perform tasks or follow procedures requiring intelligence. Okay, so here the idea is you need to avoid giving a question-begging explanation in psychology. Okay, and just to, again, I mean, this is, like I said, it's a kind of a catechism. It's something you kind of learn, if you have any background in philosophy of mind. Bill Bechtel says, assuming a homunculus with the same capacities as the agent in which it is posited to reside clearly produces no explanatory gain. Okay, so you get the picture, right? There's a certain method of explanation that psychology has to follow, and it's motivated by certain epistemic fears. Okay, so to explain intelligence, right, and by intelligence you can just say, psychological explanation, cognitive capacities, to explain the mind, right, all that mental stuff. It is permissible to posit homunculi, right, or subpersonal capacities, as long as, right, first of all, they're not identical to the capacity being explained, right, they have to be stupider, or they can't be the same thing. They not only have to be different, but they also have to be stupider in some way, right? It's not enough to merely not be the same. It also has to be, in some sense, less intelligent than what it is explaining. And Dennett puts that in terms of being less full-blooded. He puts it hemi, demi, semi, proto, quasi, whatever, right? So there has to be that distinction as well. And eventually they have to be discharged, right? Or eliminated in some way by reaching a level at which you have capacities that involve no intelligence whatsoever. And the motivation for this picture is that if you have an explanation that somehow parrots the personal level intelligent capacities that are being explained at the subpersonal levels, then the explanation will be idle, right? There'll be no explanatory gain, or it will be question-begging, right? So there's a strong epistemic motivation to say psychology needs to follow these constraints in explaining the mind. Okay, so that's your basic homuncular picture, homuncular explanatory picture that tells you what homunculi are and why we need them in psychology. Okay, so let me just look, step somewhat aside, although not entirely, to models of mechanistic explanation and their constraints, right? So mechanistic explanation, well, let's look at homunculi historically, first of all, because so in the 17th century, had the rise of mechanistic explanation as contrasted with Aristotelian explanation in terms of final causes and so forth, right? The whole idea of a historical mechanism was that everything, right, including life and so forth, could be explained in terms of direct contact motion. And the model there, the metaphor was a clock, right? So you had, the clockwork person and so forth. And whether this included the mind or not was disputed, right? So de la Mettrie said yes, you can explain people just as fancy mechanisms. And Leibniz said no, you can never explain perception. You look inside the machine. He has a famous quote, which I didn't include, but if you look inside the machine, you step inside this enlarged brain, all you're going to find is lots of wheels and things hitting each other. You're never going to find the perception, right? So the idea that you have this new approach to scientific explanation, mechanistic explanation, that's contrasted with Aristotelian explanation. Okay, so this is the early mechanistic picture. And that was supposed to, Descartes was a mechanist in everything except the mind, right? Everything, animals did not have minds. They could be completely explained in this mechanistic fashion. Okay, so within this context of a drastic change in the way you explain the natural world, homunculi, right, were lampooned, right? So the original homunculi, as in that picture I showed before, were literally, little men. Right? They were mini men that explained, how you got people from people, right? You had these little men in sperm, and that's how you got little people, because there was literally a little person in that sperm, okay? And the egg was just like protein, whatever. And so the homunculi, right? This idea that you had literally a homunculus, that's what the word means, it's a little man, right? You had the little man inside the little man, and that was part of the explanation of how you got people. And when you had this new way of explaining nature, right, then homunculi were just idle, they had no role anymore, okay? They were part of what was being rejected in the previous explanatory model, right? So when Molière talks about reference to the dormitive virtue of a sleeping pill, right? He's talking about, what he's making fun of is the Aristotelian idea that you have different virtues and things like that do the explaining, right? And when Fodor also recapitulates the sort of ridicule of homunculi when he describes gives a computational explanation of how you tie your shoes. He says, well, here's a way of explaining how you tie your shoes in a computational model. You have a little man inside who follows a rule book, and the guy following the rule book, right, learns how to tie the shoes. And that's how you tie your shoes, because you have a little man inside that follows a rule book, right? Now, he's obviously making fun of right, computational explanation in this particular way. But the idea is that, the basic idea is that you had a change of explanatory framework from basically Aristotelian, where you had virtues and homunculi and all these different posits, right, final causes and that whole package. That's being replaced by mechanisms where you've just got, sort of direct contact motion, pushing and pulling, and the way a clock operates, right? And once that's all you've got, once that's all you need for your explanations, right, then all the bells and whistles of the Aristotelian picture just become, idle posits. And then that kind of frees you to start making fun of them. Okay. Nowadays, okay, since 2000 roughly, with Machammer, Darden, Craver's article, you have what I'm calling here, at least, contemporary mechanism. And this is just the idea that, yes, we're explaining things mechanistically, but it's a much more elaborated picture of what it is to provide a mechanistic explanation. The basic idea is, you have explanation by parts of wholes, in terms of their parts and their organization and dynamics, right? And importantly, for our purposes, I don't need to go into the details of the various kinds of models of mechanistic explanation that are, discussed today. The important point is just this. The source of capacities, dynamics, processes, features, et cetera, in these mechanistic explanations are not constrained, okay, in certain ways. So Kaplan and Craver, a recent paper, say to insist on mechanistic explanations is not to insist on explanation in terms of simple machines governed by strict deterministic laws or in terms of physical contact, energy conservation, or any other fundamental or otherwise privileged set of activities. And why do you sort of have this more openness to all different kinds of processes, capacities, features, and so forth? Well, Craver says, right, one can restrict the class of machines to heroic simple machines, levers, pulleys, screws, or to extended things colliding, as in Cartesian mechanisms, or to things that attract and repel, right, as Dubois-Reymond held. Right? Each of these restrictions makes the concept of a mechanism too narrow to accommodate the diverse kinds of mechanism in contemporary neuroscience. Now, Craver is talking about neuroscience, but the point is generalizable, right? The idea is that in contemporary mechanistic explanation, you want to capture the sorts of mechanistic explanations that are actually going on in the relevant sciences, right? Physics, psychology, biology, you name it, geology, wherever they happen. And so you want your model of mechanistic explanation to be able to accommodate all the different sorts of mechanistic explanations that are actually out there and accepted. Okay, Craver works with neuroscience, but he obviously has in mind other sorts of explanation as well. Okay, so, it's worth pointing out, right, from this perspective, that outside of psychology, right, outside of the homuncular functionalist picture, right, nobody pays attention to the constraints that homuncular functionalists think are essential, right? So and I'm just going to run through a couple of examples without going into sort of specific details of the mechanistic explanation, because, I could, but it would sort of, you'll get the point without having to go into details, right? So you have a piece of machinery that lifts boxes, right? Why? Because it has an engine, and inside the engine you have a camshaft, and the camshaft lifts the valve covers, right? And that's part of the mechanistic explanation of how the machine lifts the boxes. The hole, right? The hole lifts the boxes, and the camshaft, which is a part, lifts the valve covers. Okay, a piano string, right, will vibrate, right, exhibit harmonic motion, in part because the molecules in the string vibrate, right? And, this is, a point made by Nancy Cartwright, among other people. Harmonic oscillators come in all shapes and sizes. They're at different levels of composition, right, mereological composition. Of course, living things as well, right? You are alive in part because your cells are alive, right? So being alive is not a property that only a whole can have. It's obviously also a property of your parts. You have exchanges of goods and services, right, at the country level, right? You have exchanges of goods and services at the company level, and ultimately these are going to come down to the exchanges between individuals, right? And another example, your mouth, when it opens intentionally, when you open it, as opposed to the dentist opening it for you. You open it in part because you have neurons and cardiac cells, and those have ion channels in their membranes, and those open as well, okay? So you've got all these different, myriad cases. I mean, they just multiply, where you've got a particular capacity at the level of the whole, and then you have a mechanistic explanation in terms of the parts of that whole, and those parts also do the same sorts of things. Okay, so this is a common feature of all these mechanistic explanations, and nobody bats an eye. Nobody cares that, the fact that you have a piece of machinery that lifts the boxes, and then you've got a camshaft that lifts valve covers. Nobody says, oh, you can't lift at the camshaft level because you've got lifting at the level of the hull. I mean, that doesn't even occur to anybody why this would be a constraint on the mechanistic explanation. Okay, so there's a famous poem. This was pointed out to me by John Norton. Some of you may have heard this. Big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have lesser fleas, and so ad infinitum, right? And you can do this with whorls as well in physics, but you get the point. Okay. This also occurs, I should say, in cognitive explanations. And I won't go into this in detail here, or at least maybe not until Q&A. Sutton and Bartow have developed a theory of learning, what they call the temporal difference model. And they explicitly, right, back in the 1980s and so on, they explicitly developed this model for what they called adaptive elements. And these adaptive elements could in turn comprise adaptive systems. Okay, so this model is currently being applied to both humans and to neurons, right? But from the very beginning, the model was designed with this idea in mind that you could have the same model applying at different levels within the same mereologically composed whole, right? There's nothing unusual about this. Okay, and then, at a more rhetorical level, perhaps, William Wimsatt, who is no fan of levels at all, he kind of asks rhetorically in discussing reduction, he says, memory, a property of molecules, neural circuits, tracts, hemisphere, brains and vats, embodied, socialized, enculturated beings, or institutions, right? And I say it's rhetorical because it doesn't really answer the question, right? But the implication is that, you can have memory at all these different levels, and they're all they may all be related as a part-whole relationship, right? And what's the big deal? Okay. But in addition to all these actual examples of plenty of mechanistic part-whole explanations, decompositional explanations, where you have perfectly acceptable explanations which violate the homuncular functionalist criteria, you also have philosophical arguments that say, why do you have to satisfy these criteria? So Eric Margolis, back in the 80s, right? He argued that, you've got Freudian psychology, which posits a very complicated, subpersonal level, right? And you may argue, well, maybe this is all personal level, but in any case, there are parts, right? And there's no reason to restrict the explaining capacities to ones that are somehow stupider, right? So you don't really, it doesn't seem, he argues, that you need stupidity as such to provide an explanation. You may not accept Freudian psychology, but it was an attempted explanation, right, of certain capacities that we have in terms of others. And there was nothing stupider about the explaining capacities. But Elliott-Sober makes the point, I think, a lot more clearly that you don't even need non-identity. And that was sort of the gist of all the examples that I was giving before. So he, points out with the simple case of rotation, planets rotate in part because their atoms rotate, right? And there's no problem with this. I mean, why would the fact that the planet rotates prevent the atoms from rotating? Why would that not be an explanation, right? Now, obviously, this explanation, right, doesn't tell us what rotating is. It doesn't give us a theory of types, of process types, right? That's an important issue. I'm going to set it aside in a way. But it doesn't, whatever you want to say about your theory of process types, right, it doesn't mean that planets and their atoms don't both rotate. Okay. So as Sober kind of sums up, right, what then is wrong with smart homunculi? Why must homunculi be stupider than we are if, as Chinese box explanations, as we might call them, are permitted in other domains? Okay. Okay, so let me just, raise a couple of additional problems here. Okay, first of all, we've been talking about stupider, hemi, demi, semi, prosai, quoto, whatever, capacities, subcapacities, right? I sort of sum this up, or, Lycan and Dennett and so forth sum it up as just saying they have to be stupider. Okay, so what is stupidity? Right? I mean, it's a metaphor, obviously, right? But how are we going to unpack that metaphor, right? Well, you might think, well, maybe it means it's simpler or more basic in some way. And the problem here is that we really don't have a general account, or any account at all, I should say, of what it is for a capacity to be simpler or more basic, okay? So, for example, right, planets, people, and proteins all rotate, right? At what point is rotating simpler, right? Because you have these different entities, right? You have the laws of angular momentum that apply at any level at which they appear. I mean, if it happens to be a ballerina that satisfies the equations, she's rotating, right? The point is generalizable to different quantitative models. I mean, but I think this is just a very simple case where the idea of a capacity being basic really isn't answered by saying that, well, proteins do it or atoms do it, right? Secondly, there's the issue that we have had a long history in cognitive science of thinking that we're starting with something that seems pretty complicated, like playing chess. And it turns out that the really hard problem, and Rodney Brooks has made this very clear, is trying to explain, to model, something as simple as walking upstairs, right? So we've got computers, Deep Blue and so forth, that can, beat any human being, but we still don't have robots that can do these sorts of complicated things. So, which is simpler, right? Playing chess or walking up the stairs? Intuitively, of course, we have certain ideas, but, intuitions really shouldn't be playing that sort of a role here. And third, you also have, if anybody's familiar with Rube Goldberg machines, right? Rube Goldberg made a very lucrative career for himself, inventing really complicated ways to do simple things, like putting toothpaste on your toothbrush, right? What could be simpler than that, right? Well, he has a mechanism, right, where it's like super complicated to how it's done, right? And you could, his machines are just, incredibly, they're just incredibly complicated, right? So how do we get this simpler, more basic, right? Where are these intuitions coming from about classifying particular kinds of processes as being more basic or simpler, right? Since they appear at all different levels of complexity, We can explain them more or less with more or less complexity, and even our intuitions don't even tell us clearly which is more simple than something else. Okay. It is clear, right? Our intuitions about capacities are really not clear in terms of simplicity and basicness. We do have fairly clear intuitions about entities that are simpler or more basic, right? So you think of an atom as being simpler than a molecule. And you think of a molecule as being simpler than a protein. You think of a protein as being simpler than a cell. You think of a cell as being simpler than an organ, and so forth, right? And so we have an intuitive picture of basic or simpler entities that is essentially mereological, right? You've got little, the big things are made of parts, and the parts are made of other little parts, right? And that's how we get our intuitions of simplicity and something being more basic, right? So it could be, I think this is probably right. When we talk about a simpler or more basic capacity, what we're really doing is a sort of metonymic relationship, right? Where we call the capacity basic, or we call the capacity simpler, if a lower level entity does it, right? So you might say rotating is simpler because atoms do it, right? And saying that doesn't prevent people from doing it, doesn't prevent planets from doing it, right? But we still call it simple because the low-level entities can do it, okay? So it also could be the case that you have a simpler or more basic entity, right? And that simpler or more basic entity may do less things, right? An atom doesn't have the behavioral repertoire of a planet or a ballerina, right? But everything it does can be done completely full-bloodedly, right? There's no reason to think that because this capacity is occurring at the lowest level, right? Pick your lowest level. It doesn't mean that what it's doing is not as full-blooded as anything else, right? The atom is rotating, the ballerina is rotating, the planet is rotating. It seems to be full-blooded at any level at which it occurs, right? And if you call it basic because the atoms do it, well, fine, right? But that doesn't say anything about where and what things could rotate. Okay. So let me just kind of summarize this part here. Upshot is that homuncular functionalist demands for stupid, non-identical, subpersonal capacities in decompositional psychological explanations aren't justified, right? You don't find these constraints in general explanatory practice, right? So contemporary, accepted mechanistic explanations do not follow these constraints, right? They are not rejected for being idle, right? No explanatory gain, or circular, right? And they ignore the demand for discharging or eliminating, assuming there's a difference. And I'm not sure there is one. It's also there doesn't seem to be any theoretical defense either, right? So philosophical treatments of contemporary mechanism follow the sciences, right? Scientific practices. And as I mentioned before, Margolis and Sober, among others, have questioned the constraints for theoretical reasons. Okay, so last section is ways you might say, well, maybe there's still some way to justify the constraints that make homuncular functionalism different from general mechanistic explanation. Okay, you might say, well, what's missing is something like understanding. Okay, and here the response is basically, well, if I don't understand what an activity type is, right, a process type, it doesn't matter at what level it's ascribed, right? So in other words, to go back to Sober's example of the planets rotating and the atoms in the planet rotating, right? Now, obviously, if you ask me, well, in virtue of what is the planet rotating, and you say, well, it's in virtue of, in part because its atoms are rotating and there's forces on the mass and so forth. I mean, it has to be more complicated than that, but we're just focusing on the part-whole relationship here. if I don't understand what rotating is, I'm not going to get very far with that explanation, right? I'm not going to understand really what's going on with the planet, and I'm not going to understand what's going on in the atoms either, right? But, you know, my ignorance isn't an indicator of what's real, right? I mean, the fact that I don't understand very well what rotating is doesn't entail that, therefore, the atoms cannot rotate, right? I mean, so there needs to be, so if you give an explanation in which you mention, say, rotating at the level of the whole planet, and then you give it, and in your explanation, you're mentioning also the parts, right, the atoms, and they also rotate, right? Obviously, you know, you want to say more, right? It might not be complete, but to say that it is incomplete is not to say it's idle, right? It's not to say it's circular, and it's not to say that, you know, you haven't done anything, that it's somehow, you know, violating some epistemic, rule or something. I mean, incomplete explanations are everywhere. Incomplete mechanistic explanations are among them, right? So incompleteness is not, you know, it's obviously we want to complete them, but it doesn't make an explanation, you know, somehow epistemically horrible. Second of all, if I do understand something about it, right, so I have an idea of what rotating is, I see a planet rotating, somebody says, well, you know, in the atoms, it's rotating apart because its atoms are rotating and they have mass and so forth. And I have an idea of what rotating is. Then I can gain understanding by seeing that relationship going on, by seeing the same sort of activity going on at different levels, right? And what I may learn, among other things, is not just that what the planet is doing is also replicated at the level of some of its parts, right? Oh, that's kind of interesting. That's not non-explanatory. But also, I may also come to realize that, you know, the sorts of things that I associated with rotating from my intuitive cases may not actually be essential to them, right? So, for example, if you can, if by some weird chance all your examples of rotating that you ever got in your life were from observing ballet, right, ballerinas, right, every single, now you might have the idea that, you know, rotating is being on a stage, wearing a tutu, and so forth, right? Right? And then somebody says, guess what? The planets are rotating, and these atoms are rotating, right? One of the things you might learn, and the atoms in the ballerina are also rotating, and the proteins in the ballerina are also rotating. You might say, well, gosh, you know, I thought that to rotate you had to have legs and arms and a tutu. Right? And now what you're learning is, well, you know, it turns out that rotating doesn't require those things, right? So I've learned something. I've learned that things that I associated with rotating from my sample, right, aren't actually generalizable, and that there are other reasons to think that what's going on inside the ballerina, as well as what the ballerina itself is doing, and the planet that she's on is also doing, right? Those all have something really interesting in common. We're calling that rotating. And the fact that she has arms and legs and wears a tutu and the planet doesn't and the proteins don't, you know, it's like, I've learned something about rotating. Okay, and there's also, just as a general question, is what is it, you know, why would you think that because you've ascribed something at an unfamiliar level, that somehow this is just a temporary epistemic crutch of some sort, right? I mean, the whole idea of a homuncular explanation involves this idea that, you know, you posit things that are stupider and stupider, but you have to keep going until you discharge, right? And the idea is, well, you know, if you posit something and it's at a level of composition that you haven't recognized as exhibiting that particular capacity or function, it's like, well, why think that's just temporary, right? Why would you, I mean, you know, maybe that's, we could say more about it, but there's no, it's not built into the fact that you've ascribed it at an unfamiliar level or at a part level that you have to discharge it. That discharging is like an extra condition. Okay, so, I mean, sort of a final pushback is, just this, wait a minute, I've completely missed the fact that psychology is different from everything else, right? Psychology is different from everything else because the mind is different from everything else, right? And that's a pretty basic intuition. At least that's where people will come from. And so the idea that you have these homuncular functionalist constraints that aren't generalizable to mechanistic explanation, they don't seem to have any motivation, you might say, well, the reason we've got them is because the mind is special, right? It really is a special case, so we need these special constraints. Okay, so just what I kind of just said, psychological explanation is special because you've got this conceptual boundary that you've got to cross, right? And we want to explain the mind in a non-mental vocabulary, right? That's what it is to naturalize the mind, okay? And if you don't have the homuncular criteria, then you're not explaining the mind in physical terms, right? That's the basic idea, I think. And so this kind of raises the very general question of, what does naturalism, in terms of naturalizing the mind, what does that require, right? So it's one thing to seek an explanation of psychological capacities of wholes, right, in terms of processes that their parts possess, right? That's fine, right? That's the style of explanation. Right, and by the way, I haven't said we can only explain the mind mechanistically, or we have to explain it that way, and there's no other possible style of explanation. That issue is sort of orthogonal to this talk, right? But so assuming that you're going to explain the mind mechanistically, and that's the way you want to go, and it's a legitimate way of doing it, right? It's one thing to seek that kind of explanation. Right? And then it's another thing entirely to presuppose that psychological capacities occur only at one level of composition, right? Such that the psychological terms, right, that we use to refer to these capacities are only used properly or really or literally at one level of composition, okay? So let me just say, compare these two ways of thinking about explanation. You can say, explanation, you're doing this explanation in terms of only those capacities that more basic objects can do, okay? And then you've got a different way, right, where you're saying you're giving an explanation in terms of capacities that only basic objects can do, right? Now, the first one doesn't restrict the capacities to any particular level of composition. They occur wherever they are, right? The second one does, right? The second one does make that restriction, but as I've argued, science in general, mechanistic explanation in general, doesn't follow this constraint, okay? So, in other words, I sort of wonder if, homuncular functionalism is sort of logical positivism redux. Okay, and let me explain what I mean by that. So logical positivism and the homuncular functionalist constraints appear to be, if not identical, just way too close for comfort. So in the logical positivist view of theories, you had vocabularies that were proprietary to particular levels, right? And then reduction went via bridge laws. Right? So you have a psychological vocabulary, which is appropriate to persons, right? You have a physical vocabulary that's appropriate to, brains or bodies or whatever, right? And then you need your bridge laws between the vocabularies to link the one vocabulary item, like, is in pain, with the other vocabulary item, which is C fibers, and that's how you link the theories, right? Because the theories are specific to the sciences, right? And the theories are stated in language. Okay, so you've got proprietary vocabularies for each theory in each science, right? Currently, there are a lot of different problems with the logical positivist view of theories, for a lot of other reasons, but, as a result of that, and nobody really holds logical positivist views of theories or even reduction much anymore. Theories are now broadly considered to be, this is the semantic, so-called semantic view. They're structures, right, to which objects are assigned, right? Objects and relations are assigned. And for our purposes, for my purposes, the important difference here is that the language in which the theory is stated isn't proprietary to a particular theory or a science, okay? And so if the language that's used to describe a particular theory, a particular model, particular structure, isn't proprietary to a science, right? There's no need to posit the vocabulary of the reduced level to the vocabulary of the reducing level, right? Either doing it directly versus bridge laws, pain and C fibers, or indirectly, pain, pseudo-pain, pseudo-pseudo-pain, pseudo-pseudo-pseudo-pain, stupid, all the way back, right? The homuncular functionalist picture just seems to elongate the bridge laws, right? And so there's no need to discharge the psychological vocabulary, right? And again, this idea of discharging vocabulary also seems to be a holdover from the logical positivist picture, right? Because the whole idea was, reduction meant getting rid of a vocabulary, right? That was eliminative materialism was you don't want to use the psychological because you can translate it into something else, right? There's a linguistic relationship that allows you to leave out the psychological, let it fall aside. And as the Churchlands argued, you don't even need to talk about beliefs and desires, you just talk about neurons doing certain things. So, this is kind of ironic in the end. So in the way that I described before, that historical homunculi, right, the little men, right, they had no explanatory purpose, no value in historical mechanism, push-pull mechanism, right? And so they got ridiculed, right? In a similar sort of way, the contemporary homunculi, the hemi, demi, semi, proto, quasi capacities, they don't have any real explanatory role to play. We don't even know what they are. They're stupider, but that's a metaphor. They don't really have a role to play in contemporary mechanism either, right? So they appear to be useless explanatory posits as well. All you do, what do? You explain the capacities of the whole into the capacities of the parts, wherever they are, whatever they are, period. Okay, so let me just summarize, okay? First of all, there's no epistemic problem for which we need homuncular functionalist stupider capacities. Positing the same capacities at different levels of decomposition, mereological composition, is ordinary scientific practice. Nobody gives it, nobody cares. It's captured in philosophical models of those practices. And the presupposed restrictions of psychological properties to the personal level also is unmotivated. And the demands for homunculi and discharging, they seem to be holdovers from the logical positivist view of theories, where theories are associated with particular vocabularies. And all you're doing is taking logical positivism and making and extending the bridge laws into steps. Okay, so that's my recommendation. I think we should just get rid of homunculi and for once and for all. We got rid of the other ones. Maybe we should get rid of these ones too. Some of the implications, we just don't have any reason to hyperventilate when psychological terms are used at subpersonal levels, and this also goes for superpersonal levels. I haven't talked about group minds. Rob talked about group minds. I kind of focused on the subpersonal given the talk, right? But it's obvious that it can go either way, right? So I'm not just saying it's just the subpersonal. It also could be groups as well. Okay. we also avoid positing these mysterious stupider, semi, hemi, demi, quasi, proto, whatever capacities, right? And this idea of discharging, which seems to go beyond merely explaining, okay? And we're also motivated, I think, to think about naturalizing the mind in a more scientifically driven way, right, rather than by intuitions. We're not distracted by these unlimited homuncular functionalist fears of what we are or are not allowed to use as part of our explananda, sorry. So that's it. Thank you.